Good evening. Wherever you are listening from, whether it is late at night or the early hours before sleep, you are welcome here. Tonight, we will travel north to the cold, endless ocean, where even the gods listened in silence. Thor, the god of thunder, the strongest of the Aesir, feared many things, but few know that the sea at night unsettled him the most. Beneath the dark water slept Jörmungandr, the World Serpent, coiled around the earth, waiting for the day the world would end. At night, when the waves grew quiet and the wind no longer answered his hammer, Thor listened. Not for thunder, but for movement beneath the sea. Tonight's story is about that silence. The silence before Ragnarök. So settle in, breathe slowly, and if you enjoy quiet stories of gods, myths, and forgotten nights, you are welcome to subscribe and rest here whenever the world feels too loud. Now, let us begin. Thor feared no beast, no blade, no fate. He had stood alone at the gates of Jotunheim. He had cracked skulls with a hammer that sang thunder through 10 realms. When armies hesitated, Thor advanced. When others debated, Thor acted. But there was one thing he never did. He never sailed alone after nightfall. No one questioned it. No one teased him. He was the god of thunder. If he said a ship needed more hands, people stepped aboard. But those closest to him noticed. If dusk fell and the voyage had not ended, Thor grew quiet. He didn't pace, he didn't show tension, but his hand rested on Mjolnir a little longer. His eyes scanned the horizon a little slower, and when he spoke, it was clipped, controlled. The others assumed it was vigilance. They were wrong. It was fear. Not the kind born of danger, the kind born of memory. Because once, long ago, Thor had seen something in the ocean, and it had not struck him. It had waited. The sea had never been his domain. Odin had ravens. Frey had fertility. Njord had the wind and waves. Thor had storms. Skybound, fierce, and above all else, loud. But under the surface, the sea kept its own rhythm, its own rules. It didn't roar. It listened. And when Thor was younger, that distinction didn't matter. He had fought sea monsters, slain krakens, tossed boulders into whirlpools just to see how far they'd go. He treated the sea like an obstacle, not a world. That changed after the fishing trip. The tale had been told 1,000 times. Thor and the giant Hymir out on a boat, trying to catch the Midgard serpent. It was a story passed around mead halls, how Thor baited the hook with an ox head, how he hauled the serpent up, how he nearly cracked its skull before Hymir panicked and cut the line. But the version Thor remembered was different. In his memory, the serpent did not fight. It watched. It rose slowly, as if allowing itself to be pulled. Its eyes locked on his, unblinking, vast and still. It did not hiss. It did not strike. It simply stared. And in that moment, Thor felt something he had never known. The sense that he was not being challenged. He was being studied. That look never left him. He laughed when the tale was retold. He roared when others praised his strength. But inside, something had been set in motion. Because strength was supposed to provoke resistance. The serpent had given him none. It hadn't flinched when he lifted Mjolnir. It hadn't recoiled when the hammer came down. It had only stared, as if waiting for something else. Something Thor couldn't name. When Hymir cut the line, Thor didn't shout in anger. He stayed silent, and for the rest of that night, he didn't sleep. The years that followed were filled with war. Giants returned to their old ambitions. Mortals tested the gods with new myths. Loki's mischief deepened into strategy. Thor remained the shield of Asgard, unyielding, necessary, feared. But every battle felt slightly less real than that moment on the sea. The serpent hadn't disappeared. It hadn't died. It hadn't even spoken. It had endured. And Thor knew that silence was not mercy. It was control. The serpent could have ended him. It didn't. And that choice made Thor uneasy in ways he would never say aloud. When he looked out at the ocean now, he didn't see distance. He didn't see nature. He didn't even see water. He saw waiting, and not the passive kind, the active, intentional, patient kind. The sea was not Thor's battlefield. It was the serpent's cathedral. And Thor, for all his strength, was not a god made for cathedrals. He was made for impact, noise, forward motion. But the ocean at night, it didn't care how loud he was. It answered only with depth and silence. Thor never turned away from it, but he never turned his back to it either. When the wind shifted and the sea calmed without reason, he gripped Mjolnir just a little tighter. When night fell over water and the sky held no stars, he stayed standing. No prayers, no explanations, just the growing awareness that his greatest opponent wasn't planning. It was waiting, and it would not move until it was ready. Thor understood that now. And that was why he never sailed alone at night. Not because he feared the dark, but because he feared what might be listening just beneath it. There were no doctrines about it. No laws or rules in Asgard that declared the ocean off limits to the god of thunder. No formal moment when Thor admitted he feared anything at all. But patterns speak when words do not. And the pattern was clear. Every mission that required sea travel after nightfall was either delegated or delayed. If none of those options were possible, Thor ensured he was never alone, not because he needed help, but because he needed a witness, someone else to verify what might appear if it chose to rise again. He didn't explain this. He didn't need to. The other gods had their own silences, and they respected his, but they noticed that when Thor crossed over bridges of light, he walked with purpose. And when he crossed over water, he walked like someone who expected something to rise beneath his feet. No one mocked him because no one understood what he had seen. Even Odin never asked. It was possible that he knew or suspected what had happened during that fishing trip, but he didn't press. He didn't summon Thor for explanation. He allowed the memory to harden into silence. Perhaps Odin knew that some fears were not errors. They were warnings. And warnings, when ignored, do not vanish. They wait. Thor trained harder after that encounter. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't weak. He hadn't failed. And yet, something inside him had shifted. Not toward panic, but toward preparation. The silence of the serpent was more threatening than its size, because silence implied confidence, and confidence meant calculation. What kind of creature allowed itself to be pulled up from the depths, just to look its enemy in the eye? Not a beast, a rival. Thor never called Jörmungandr that aloud. But in private moments when storms passed, he remembered those eyes, not glowing, not furious, just watching. And he knew with certainty that Serpent had not forgotten him either. In time, stories of Jörgen became background noise. Mortals told tales of it circling Midgard, keeping balance. Others claimed it was dead or dormant. Priests invented explanations. Scholars argued theories. Poets sang of Thor's triumph. But Thor never repeated the tale. He knew it wasn't finished. He had felt it. And every time he stood near a darkened sea, that feeling returned. Not prophecy, recognition. Somewhere beneath the waves, the Midgard serpent waited, not for an opportunity, for a moment. And when that moment came, Thor knew it wouldn't roar, it wouldn't warn, it would rise. It was supposed to be a show of strength. Thor had no interest in diplomacy that day. The sea was calm, and the giants were mocking. So when Heimer challenged him to prove his worth, Thor agreed, not with a speech, but with action. They set out on the boat just before dawn. Heimer had no real plan. He thought it would be amusing to watch Thor try and catch anything worth bragging about. The ocean to him was a tool. Deep, dangerous, but predictable. Thor was quiet, focused. He didn't bait the line with scraps. He tore the head from a great ox and drove the hook through its jaw. He was not fishing. He was summoning. Heimer chuckled. "You expect the serpent to answer that?" Thor didn't reply. The hook sank. The waves around the boat flattened. No wind. No gulls. No sound. Then came the pull. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deliberate, like something below had noticed and was deciding. Thor braced himself. The line tightened. His arm locked. He didn't shout. He didn't strain. He waited. The boat tilted forward, its bow inching down as if being drawn toward the ocean floor. Heimer panicked. He shouted, tried to cut the rope. Thor held it with one hand and held Heimer off with the other. Not yet. The water bulged ahead of the boat, rising but not breaking. Then the eyes appeared. Massive, still, and unblinking. They weren't glowing. They didn't flash with rage. They simply stared. Jörmungandr was rising. Not surging, not attacking, just surfacing. It was as if the serpent had allowed itself to be caught. Thor met its gaze. For a moment, the sea was not sea. The boat was not a boat. There was no sky, no air, no wind. Just pressure and presence. Jörmungandr didn't open its mouth. It didn't strike. It hovered at the surface, coiled beneath the boat, its head towering just above the waves. Thor reached for Mjolnir. He didn't raise it immediately. He watched, waiting for a signal, a twitch, a breath. But there was nothing. No threat, no fear, just observation. Hymir screamed. He took out his knife and cut the line. The serpent vanished below, not with a splash, but a fold, like the sea had been hiding a seam that closed behind it. Thor didn't move. His grip on the hammer loosened slowly. Hymir was already rowing, muttering prayers, cursing the gods, his hands trembling. Thor sat still. He hadn't struck. He could have, but something had told him not to. He didn't understand it. He didn't question it, but he obeyed it. Because that moment, those eyes had shifted the weight of the world slightly. The serpent had seen them and chosen to do nothing. They didn't speak on the way back. When they landed, Heimer told a tale full of bravado and danger. He described a monster barely repelled by Thor's strength. He made himself the fool and Thor the hero. Thor didn't correct him. He let the myth take shape. Because it was easier than explaining what had actually happened. That he had faced the end of all things, and it had blinked never. After that day, Thor avoided speaking about the sea. Not out of shame, out of precision. Because the sea was no longer an environment to him, it was a boundary. A place where the known ended and something else began. Odin noticed, so did Tyr, but neither questioned it. They understood that some battles don't end in blood. Some battles are postponed, and this was one of them. Years passed. The story of Thor's fishing trip grew into legend. Mortals turned it into saga. Artists painted waves crashing, hammers raised, serpents roaring. None of them got it right. The truth was quieter, and that made it heavier. Because if Jörmungandr had attacked and failed, the story would be over. But it didn't attack. It surfaced. And then it waited. Thor knew the difference, and it haunted him. Every time Thor stood near the shore, that moment replayed. Not in flashbacks or visions, just in a simple shift of breath. The tension returned. The question repeated. Why didn't it strike? Was it uninterested? Or was it saving the moment? No one else asked. Everyone assumed Thor had won something that day. Thor wasn't so sure. He didn't feel like he'd survived a battle. He felt like he'd passed a test. One he didn't know he'd taken. And the serpent? It wasn't angry. It was patient. He trained differently after that. More precision. Less noise. He started to time his strikes, learning not just when to hit, but when not to. Because if the serpent had taught him anything, it was this. Power without control was predictable, and Jörmungandr was not. Thor never told anyone what he really felt that day, not even Odin, because there was no lesson in it, only a shift. No, the world hadn't changed, but Thor had. He stopped challenging storms for sport. He stopped calling down thunder unless it was needed. He stopped mistaking noise for dominance, because what he had seen in Jörmungandr wasn't rage or chaos. It was certainty, and certainty unnerved him more than power ever could. He wondered sometimes if the serpent remembered him, not in the way mortals feared being remembered by gods, but in the way one opponent remembers another between rounds. The serpent hadn't seen a threat. It had seen a schedule, something yet to come. And Thor, for all his might, had become part of it. Not as the end, as the next step. After that encounter, Thor's relationship with the sea changed. He didn't avoid it, but he respected it in a new way. He refused to sail without purpose. No more fishing, no more idle travel over deep waters. The sea had become a message board, and the serpent its silent scribe. Every ripple felt like a whisper. Every calm tide a delay. He knew the next meeting wouldn't be accidental. It would be chosen. The few times he returned to that part of the ocean, he sensed the depth differently, as if there was something conscious beneath it, not active, just aware, and waiting. He never tried to summon the serpent again, because he knew it didn't need a reason to rise, only a moment. And when that moment came, it wouldn't need bait. It would come because it had already decided. And Thor, somehow, had always been part of that decision. He told no one about the stillness, about the way the serpent hadn't moved like an animal, but like a calculation, that it had let him see it, let him imagine victory, let him leave. And that choice lingered longer than any wound ever had. When others asked what it was like to face the Midgard serpent, Thor gave them the version they expected. He described the size, the scale, the strength. He did not describe the silence, because silence was not a detail. It was the point. And in that silence, he heard what strength alone could never answer. A question. Are you ready? Thor wasn't sure, and that's what haunted him. Not that the serpent had lived, but that it had waited, and still was. The serpent had vanished, but the silence had stayed. Thor tried to move on, fought giants, crushed rebellions, restored borders. But no matter how many victories followed, one question followed him back. Why didn't it strike? The Midgard serpent had the chance. He had it on the line. No traps, no tricks, no armies. Just Thor alone and an enemy born to end him. And it chose not to attack. That silence became a presence in his thoughts. Not fear, uncertainty. Thor was not a thinker. He didn't brood over possibilities. His world was action and consequence. But this wasn't a possibility. It was a fact. Jörmungandr had seen him, measured him, and withheld judgment. That wasn't a retreat. That was control. He tried to bury the thought beneath war. Whenever new threats rose in the realms, Thor volunteered. He welcomed chaos. He welcomed confrontation. But between every clash, the silence returned, not with a voice, with a weight. It settled in his chest before long voyages. It stirred in him at the edge of every shore. The sea wasn't whispering, it was remembering. And Thor knew it was not his memory alone. The serpent had not forgotten, and the question still hung between them, unspoken, unanswered. Why did you spare me? Or worse, what are you waiting for? He tried asking Odin once. Not directly, just a passing question at the end of a war council. What do you do when an enemy lets you go? Odin had paused. Depends, he said. Did they lose the chance, or did they choose not to take it? Thor had said nothing. Odin had added, one makes them a fool, the other makes them a future. Thor never brought it up again, because he already knew which one it was. The serpent had not missed an opportunity. It had scheduled a reckoning. And Thor was part of that plan. Not by choice, by placement. He wasn't being hunted, he was being prepared. And that changed everything. He began to see signs. Nothing supernatural, just moments. Calm waters where storms should be. Unfamiliar birds landing near his camp. Winds changing without cause as he neared the coast. None of them were threats, but they weren't accidents either. Thor started keeping records, not in scrolls, but in memory. The places where silence felt heavier. The nights when he woke before dawn for no reason. The sense that something vast was adjusting its path just slightly, like a ship realigning to port. It was subtle, but persistent. And over time, undeniable. Thor wasn't being watched. He was being timed. He tried to speak to Loki, not because he trusted him, but because Loki saw patterns others missed. He asked him what it meant when something ancient waited longer than expected. Loki raised an eyebrow. Depends on the thing. A serpent, Thor said. Loki went quiet. Then he laughed softly. If it waits, it's not hungry. Thor didn't laugh. Loki leaned closer. Then you're not the meal. What am I? Loki shrugged. A witness or a key? That thought didn't leave him. A key. Thor wasn't being spared. He was being kept, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. And he hated that more than fear. Because fear fades. Purpose does not. He tried to bury himself in duty. More patrols, more missions, more giants to crush. He worked until his muscles ached, and the lightning in his blood quieted. But the silence always returned. The ocean never called him. It didn't need to. It waited, with the patience of something that had circled the world since time's beginning. Something that didn't measure moments in battles, but in balances. Thor began to realize something worse than fear. Jörmungandr might not hate him. It might need him, not as an enemy, as a participant, in something neither of them had started. But both of them were built to end. He tried asking the seers, disguised, distant, respectful. What does it mean when two forces are destined to meet, but don't? The seer blinked. It means the world is not ready. And if they wait too long, then the world changes to make them meet. Thor asked no more. Because he understood. He and the serpent were not just opponents. They were inevitabilities, and the longer they waited, the more tightly their paths would coil, until every movement in the world was just the tightening of a knot neither could escape. Not fate, structure, and that's what made the silence so unbearable. It wasn't empty, it was engineered. Thor started dreaming, not visions, moments. Standing on a cliff at night, no wind, no sound, just the horizon, and something rising, always rising. He never saw its full shape, just the shadow, the scale, the sense that the ocean wasn't water, but armor, and something inside it was waking. He never woke in fear. He woke with urgency, and the dreams never left him with questions. They left him with countdowns, not marked by days or signs, but by silence that deepened like pressure before a storm. He once thought Ragnarök would roar into being. Now he wondered if it would whisper first, and only afterward strike. He tried asking the sea itself, not with words, with presence. He stood on empty shores during moonless nights. Let the salt air coat his lungs. Let the silence wash over him. Sometimes the waves didn't move. Other times they crept forward once, then receded like a breath. He wasn't expecting answers. He was looking for rhythm. And slowly he found it. Not in tides or winds, but in patience. The same patience he saw in Jörmungandr's eyes, a waiting that wasn't passive, it was choosing. And Thor began to accept something that unsettled every instinct he had. The serpent wasn't hiding. It was watching the same world he was, and counting, just like him. He tried asking the Norns, not directly. He walked past the roots of Yggdrasil and stood in the mist near the well of Urd. No one spoke, but the silence there was different. Not absence, anticipation. As if the future was bending towards something too old to change course. He asked nothing, because by then he understood. Answers wouldn't help. The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to change him, and it had. The serpent had not struck because it didn't need to. Its role wasn't to test Thor. Its role was to wait until Thor was no longer just a hammer, but a decision. And now, Thor felt that decision drawing closer, not with sound, but with gravity. It began with a report. A fishing village on the far edge of Midgard, forgotten by most maps, claimed the tides had reversed for a single night. Not in full, just enough to notice. The boats didn't drift toward shore. They pulled away. No storms, no winds, no explanation. When Thor heard the message, he didn't hesitate. He left alone. No envoy, no army, just Mjolnir at his side and a silence he already recognized. The village was empty when he arrived. No blood, no destruction, just absence. Nets left half-folded, doors open, food still warm on some hearths, as if the people had been called somewhere, quietly and willingly. Thor walked the shoreline at dusk. The sea was flat, too flat, not calm, expectant. He stepped into the surf. No tide pushed back. The water wrapped around his boots like something reaching, not resisting. He looked out toward the horizon and saw nothing and felt everything. It wasn't fear, it was familiarity. The same presence from that boat years ago. Not roaring, not writhing, just near. He found no tracks, no signs of struggle, but he found a pattern in the sand. Not symbols, not runes, just indentations, long, curved, precise. The shape of something watching from beneath the surface, waiting, not to strike, to listen. He stayed the night at the village edge. No fire, no light, just the steady rhythm of waves that didn't move forward or back. At midnight, the air shifted. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like a breath held too long. And then came the sound, not a roar or whisper, but something between echo and pulse. Thor stood. He did not call for it. He did not raise Mjolnir. He simply waited, because whatever was coming wasn't a fight. Not yet. It was contact. Nothing emerged. Nothing needed to. The presence was enough. A reminder. Thor had not been forgotten. And the sea had not changed course. Only paused. By morning, the ocean returned to normal. Waves moved. Gulls circled. The village was still empty, but the pressure had lifted. Thor searched again. This time inland, he found faint footprints leading into the forest. Too many for a single person. Too clean for a stampede. He followed them for miles until they vanished at the base of a cliff. There was no cave, no markings, just a wall of stone, and the sense that whoever had walked there was not meant to be found. He placed his hand on the rock. It was warm, as if the sun had been there before him, though the cliff faced west, and beneath the warmth, vibration. Low, distant, rhythmic, not mechanical, living. He stood there for a long time, listening, not for words, not for clues, for confirmation. And it came not in sound, but in understanding. The village was not destroyed. It was reclaimed by something beneath the land, or beside it, or older than both. And the people hadn't run. They've been summoned, or maybe chosen. Thor didn't know which disturbed him more. He returned to the shore, waited for sunset. This time, he spoke aloud. "I know you're still watching." Nothing replied, but the waves once again went still, as if in agreement or acknowledgement. The silence wasn't passive. It had become a language, and Thor was learning to listen. He stayed another night, not as a guard, but as a witness. He wanted to see what the sea would do with no audience but him. The stars disappeared early, though no clouds covered them. The wind died without warning, and the horizon blurred, as if the line between water and sky had grown uncertain. Then, far out at sea, something moved, not toward him, just across. A shadow beneath the surface, massive, slow, deliberate, not hiding, surveying. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't call out, because this wasn't an opponent crossing his path. It was the path itself, adjusting, not advancing the battle, just reminding him it was still planned. When he returned to Asgard, he said nothing. No report, no warnings, just silence. Because words would turn it into a story, and stories suggested endings. This was not an ending. It was the next breath before a long-held note resumed. Thor resumed his duties, but differently. He watched the oceans more closely, paid attention to forgotten coastlines, tracked stories of ships that vanished without violence. None of them were proof, but all of them were signs. The serpent was shifting, not waking, positioning, and the world wasn't resisting. It was clearing space. He returned to the village one final time. Months had passed. Nature had begun reclaiming the empty homes. Vines curling through windows. Moss softening rooftops. But none of it felt abandoned. It felt paused. He walked the shoreline again. No pattern in the sand this time. But the feeling remained. This was not his territory. It never had been. This sea belonged to something else, and it had only ever tolerated him because it needed him alive. Thor sat at the edge of the water, He didn't summon lightning. He didn't speak oaths. He just waited. And for the first time since the serpent had stared into his eyes, he felt no need to act, only to listen. Because when it came again, it wouldn't be asking, it would be answering. He began to understand that this wasn't about readiness. It was about recognition. The serpent had looked at him once and chosen patience. Now it was reminding him of that choice. Thor didn't know what the next moment would bring, whether battle or collapse, silence or storm. But he knew one thing with certainty. Jörmungandr was not delaying. It was aligning. The ocean, the tides, the missing village, none of it was warning. It was orientation. Like pieces placed carefully on a board for a move that hadn't yet been made, but would be, soon. And Thor, the god of thunder, destroyer of giants, breaker of fortresses, was no longer preparing to strike. He was preparing to understand. Not because he feared the serpent, but because he finally knew what it meant to be seen by something older than war, and chosen to wait alongside it. It started with lightning, not his. A storm rolled over the mountains east of Vanaheim. No thunder, just flashes, silent, rhythmic, but wrong. Thor felt it before he saw it. What didn't pull the sky apart, it stitched it together. The bolts weren't bright, they were veins, lighting up clouds like nerves awakening. And Thor knew instantly, this wasn't leather, it was a signal. He left Asgard that night, didn't tell anyone, didn't need to, because he wasn't responding to a threat. He was responding to a pattern. The serpent had shifted the seas. Now something was wrenching through the air. The storm didn't move. It hovered. Not over land, not over water, over nothing, just empty sky. Thor climbed a ridge overlooking the plains. From there, he watched the lightning form shapes that didn't repeat, lines that curved without direction, pulses that formed no pattern. Yet it felt deliberate, like something was drawing in a language he didn't understand. He stayed until dawn. The storm vanished with the sun. No clouds retreated. No wind carried it off. It simply stopped, as if it had delivered something and left. Thor said nothing to the others, but he began to map the skies. He started noticing changes. Stars out of place, constellations dimming, colors in the sky that lasted a moment too long, birds flying at night, all without explanation. Odin said it was the age turning. The elves said it was magic rebalancing. But Thor knew it wasn't change. It was preparation. Something was moving overhead. Not fast, not loud, but wide. As if the sky itself had begun to tilt. One night, he saw a ring. Not in the clouds, in the stars. Like a wheel turning just above vision. He blinked and it was gone. But he wasn't imagining it. Because the air didn't feel like air anymore. It felt like a roof, flexing. Something enormous was repositioning above them. And whatever it wasn't ignoring him. It was watching him from the highest point of all, the silence in the sky. He started waking before storms. Hours before clouds gathered, he would feel a tightness, not pain, not dread, just focus, and always above, not around. He stopped seeing storms as natural. They became messages. Some were simple, static building and fading. Others lingered, not in place, but in meaning. One night, he watched a lightning bolt split silently across a cloudless sky. No sound, no echo. But on the ground, a tree miles away split in half. No smoke, no fire, just division. Like a border had been drawn. He didn't approach the tree. He didn't need to. The message was clear. The sky was marking territory, and the ground had accepted. He started noticing animals behaving strangely. Wolves howled without breath. Crows flew in spirals and vanished mid-flight. Horses refused to look at the sky. Even the goats that pulled his chariot grew restless before dusk. And always, when Thor looked up, he saw nothing. But he felt something. Like pressure behind his eyes. Like a name he couldn't remember hovering just out of reach. One night, during a festival in Alfheim, a child approached him, barefoot, soot on her cheek. She said, "It's not looking for you." Thor knelt. "What is?" "The circle." "What does it want?" She blinked. "To finish the other half." Then she walked away. No one else had seen her, and the ground where she stood was scorched. Thor didn't search for answers anymore. He searched for mirrors. Not reflective glass. Echoes. Moments in the past that felt like now. He remembered when Jörmungandr had surfaced. That pressure, that silence. The sky had begun to feel the same way. Not threatening, coiled, as if something enormous was present, but compressed, contained, not because it had to be, but because it chose to be. He stood on high places for hours at a time. Cliffs, mountaintops, watchtowers, not looking for light, looking for coordination. The serpent had the sea. Whatever this was, it had the sky. And they were aligning, not colliding, not yet, but aligning like gears in a clock that only ticked once. He started noticing when Mjolnir grew warm, not during combat, but when storms passed without touching land, or when birds froze mid-air as if something above had paused them. The hammer wasn't reacting to weather, it was reacting to design. Whatever force moved in the sky, it wasn't wild, it was measured. And Mjolnir, crafted from the heart of a dying star, recognized it, not as a threat, as a peer. He brought this to Odin, described the silence, the symbols, the stillness in the storms. Odin listened, did not interrupt, then said one thing: if the sea has chosen and the sky has stirred, the ground will not stay silent. Thor didn't answer, because he already felt the truth of it. The alignments were spreading, and the serpent was only the beginning. He started preparing, not with weapons, but awareness. Mapped ley lines, marked storm paths, noted where lightning struck twice. It wasn't superstition. It was structure. The world was building toward something, and the sky, like the sea before it, was no longer background. It was participant. He climbed to the highest peak in Midgard one final time. No wind, no clouds, just the vast dome of stars above. He spoke aloud. "I don't need to know when." Silence. "I just need to know there." The wind returned, briefly, just one gust, but it carried the scent of salt, and beneath it, ash. Thor didn't move, didn't flinch, because he understood it wasn't just the serpent anymore. Now the sky had memory, and it was choosing a direction. Days passed without storm. Then came a night where the moon vanished. Not behind clouds, it simply didn't rise. Instead, a faint ring of light hovered above the horizon. It did not pulse. It rotated, slowly. Thor stood beneath it, feeling the pressure in his ribs. Mjolnir trembled. From recognition, the ring didn't descend. It expanded, until the stars beyond it dimmed. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Not vanished, just paused, like a breath drawn in and never let out. The next morning, Thor was different. Not weaker, not stronger, just tuned, like his steps now followed something he couldn't yet name, but already obeyed. He didn't speak of it to anyone, not because he feared misunderstanding, but because language wasn't useful anymore. Not for this. Not for sky rings and silent bolts and pressure without form. This wasn't prophecy. It was positioning. And Thor wasn't just a warrior now. He was a thread in something vast, woven by tides, counted by clouds, guided by rhythms that began before the gods. He stood at the edge of a cliff at night, looking upward. He didn't raise Mjolnir. He didn't pray. He just whispered 2 words. I'm listening. And the sky for the first time responded. With nothing, because nothing was now the clearest message of all. It was not the sea or sky that moved next. It was the roots. Deep beneath Yggdrasil, whispers began, not words, frequencies. Odin felt it first. His ravens refused to perch on the tree. The forges flickered when no wind blew. And the elves, they began to dream of cracks in soil that bled light. Something old was shifting, not waking, remembering. Thor was called to the tree not by decree but by instinct. He arrived before the others. The air around Yggdrasil was thicker than usual, not with magic, but with memory. And the bark hummed, not with life, but with intention. Thor placed a hand on the trunk. The hum grew stronger, not louder, but clearer. A song without melody, playing just beneath perception. He didn't ask what it meant. He asked what it wanted. And the tree replied, not in words, but pressure. Images, not visions, weights. A stone cracking in deep earth. Tunnels filling with something that should not rise. Not evil, not chaos, but Bowens delayed too long. The other gods arrived slowly. Freyr paused outside the glade. Eyes narrowed. Tyr said nothing, but his grip on his blade tightened. Even Frigg, who rarely left her chambers, stood at the edge of the grove without speaking. They all felt it. The roots were stirring, and the world was adjusting. Odin stepped forward last. His single eye did not blink. He placed his palm on the tree. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the roots beneath their feet shifted, not breaking, not rising, just tightening, as if the tree had exhaled once in the last 1,000 years, and now it was drawing breath again. The gods waited. But Yggdrasil did not speak. It only remembered. And in its memory, Thor saw something. Not the serpent, not the sky, but a spiral underground. Vast, slow, older than the gods. A presence beneath presence. Not sleeping, anchored. It wasn't part of Ragnarök. It was before it. Before prophecy, before war. The third silence. One that held the weight of the other 2. Thor asked no questions. He didn't need to. Because the answers were not lessons. They were roles. He was not just watching anymore. He was standing on the fault line between what had moved and what had been still too long. The roots were not stirring in rebellion. They were sinking. In the days that followed, the ground behaved strangely. Earthquakes without tremors. Stone cracking but leaving trees untouched. Animals digging holes and not returning. Springs drying overnight, only to reappear in different places. The dwarves called it imbalance. The seers called it reckoning. But Thor called it alignment, because it matched the sea, and it matched the sky. And now, the earth was answering in kind, not with fury, with precision. He returned to the tree again and again, not to speak, to listen. The hum grew clearer each time. He began to recognize patterns in the roots, like veins pulsing slowly, deliberately, in sync with something far beneath. One day he felt it directly, a single vibration, sharp, not painful, but deep, like the crack of a seal, or a gate unhinging far below. That night he dreamed not of sky or sea, but of stone, endless stone, slabs turning in the dark, forming rings, and in the center, nothing, not void, space, waiting for something to occupy it, or return to it. He woke without sweat, but with certainty. The earth was not just a stage, it was a vault, and something inside was waking up on schedule. Thor began to consult the oldest beings he could find, not gods, creatures. A worm who had never left its cavern, a stone elemental beneath the mountains, a moss-covered troll that hadn't spoken in 1,000 years. None of them spoke clearly, but all of them agreed on one thing. The earth was remembering how to move, and what it had once restrained. He asked one final question of an ancient rooted being in Jotunheim, half tree, half mind. "What's waking?" It answered with 3 words. What never slept. Ken, it grew silent, and its leaves withered, as if its purpose had ended. Thor didn't press, because he felt it too. This wasn't awakening, it was resumption. Thor began to feel it in the soles of his feet, not tremors, rhythms, like footsteps that never reached the surface. He could tell when he stood on a place that mattered, not because it shook, but because it listened. Certain stones carried sound longer, certain soil held heat longer, and when he placed Mjolnir down in those places, it vibrated faintly, as if answering. He asked Odin what lay beneath all things. Odin only said, "Everything we buried." Thor asked what they buried. Odin didn't reply, but his eye didn't blink for a long time, and Thor understood. The gods didn't fear what was coming. They feared what was coming back. Thor began marking the places where the hum was strongest. Old ruins, dead groves, forgotten altars. Places not touched by recent war, but important. He noticed patterns. They weren't random. They formed a ring, a massive one, like a seal around the heart of the world. He shared this with no one. Not out of secrecy, out of scale, because what he saw wasn't a strategy. It was a pulse. Each place in that circle was a beat, and the beat was getting stronger, faster, more in sync. Something wasn't arriving. It was already here, waiting for the last piece to land. Thor returned once more to Yggdrasil. He didn't expect words. He didn't even expect signs. He simply wanted to be there when the next alignment struck. The ground beneath the tree had changed. It was softer, not with decay, with pressure, as if the soil beneath it had warmed. He placed Mjolnir down and waited. Hours passed. Then came a breath, not wind, but motion. From beneath, rising, passing through his legs like heat, through his chest like memory. It didn't hurt, but it stayed. A signal not to act, but to hold, the way one does before a final note in a song, before silence becomes sound again. Thor began to see the serpent differently now, not just as the sea's sentinel, but as the first movement in a score that was unfolding across elements. The sky had mirrored it. The earth was now joining, but none of them had spoken. They had only adjusted. And that silence was louder than prophecy, because prophecy required belief. This did not. This was structure. He stood beneath Yggdrasil one last time before leaving. He said only this: "If the roots rise, I will not run." The tree did not answer, but the hum faded for just a moment, like a nod, not of approval, but of confirmation. He was not the trigger, he was the bridge, and the bridge had begun to bear weight. Loki had known from the beginning, not because he saw the signs, because he was one. He didn't read the sky or measure the sea. He didn't place his hand on the bark of Yggdrasil. He simply waited, because waiting was the shape of knowing. And Loki knew that when the silence spread, it wasn't ignorance, it was design. He said nothing to Thor, because Thor would ask questions, and Loki had no answers, only certainty. He didn't track patterns. He recognized rhythms, because chaos was not disorder. It was movement before structure. And the serpent, the storm, the roots, they weren't signs of chaos. They were its memory, returning to form. Loki had never feared Jörmungandr, not because it was his child, because it wasn't his enemy. He understood what the others refused to admit. The serpent's gaze wasn't threatening. It was reflective. It didn't ask permission. It didn't need revenge. It was the shape of inevitability, and Loki knew that shape well. He wore it every time he was blamed for a crack he didn't cause. Every time he was punished for speaking what others whispered. Every time a god smiled and called him brother while locking a door behind him. He was not outside the prophecy. He was its shadow, moving when the light shifted. So when the silence reached the sky and sank into the ground, Loki didn't act. He smiled, because everything was finally arriving where he had been all along. He visited the edge of Asgard only once during the alignments. He stood beneath a broken statue of himself, one he hadn't built and hadn't protested when they tore it down. He looked up at it. It had no head. He smiled. Then he turned to the east, where the mountains met the void, and listened. There was no wind, no birds, just the feeling of breath being held. Everywhere, he could hear the shape of the pause now, each realm waiting, not because they were afraid, but because something ancient was resuming a sentence no one had ever let it finish. And Loki? He'd been born mid-sentence. He recognized the grammar of fate, even when others heard only silence. He visited Frigg in secret. No guards saw him. He walked through shadows like they were invitations. She didn't turn to face him, but she said, "It's already in motion." Loki nodded. "I know, I didn't start it." "No," she said, "but it remembers your shape." He stepped beside her. They both stared at the horizon, where clouds curled in slow spirals. "You still blame me?" he asked. She didn't answer, because that wasn't the question, and he hadn't asked it to hear the answer. He was confirming what he already understood. Guilt was irrelevant. He wasn't part of the fault. He was part of the frame. And now the picture was finally forming. Loki returned to his quiet place, one of the few realms that did not bear a name in Asgardian maps. He walked its borders, touching stones that had no carvings, no markers. They didn't need them, because some places carried truth without needing symbols. This was one of them, and truth had never needed translation. It only needed patience. He sat by a pool that reflected nothing, not because the water was dark, because it remembered too much. He whispered into it, not spells, reminders, and the surface rippled, not outward, but inward, as if something beneath had sighed. That was when he knew the roots had reached this far. The earth had not waited for permission. It had always been listening. Now it was responding. Loki didn't need to speak to Thor, because Thor was already seeing what he had once ignored. The sea wasn't a battleground anymore. The sky wasn't a vault, and the earth wasn't a fleep. They were all voices in a chorus Loki had always heard, and now the others were learning the melody. Late, but not too late, he began writing symbols into stone, not to warn, not to teach, to record, because this time he didn't intend to speak when the others shouted. He intended to remember when they forgot. Because they would forget again. They always did. That was their pattern. But Loki was a pattern breaker. And a pattern bearer at once. Like the serpent, like the storm, like the deep hum of roots pulling memory toward the surface. He visited the vaults of Asgard, not to steal, to look. Because some artifacts weren't relics, they were markers. He passed blades that had never been drawn, helmets forged for wars that never came, scrolls sealed with wax that no one dared to melt. And behind them all, one thing stood untouched. A mirror with no reflection. Because it didn't show the viewer. It showed what the realm saw in them. Loki stood before it. It remained blank. He smiled, because even the world couldn't predict him anymore. He stepped back into shadow, and in that absence of image, he found clarity. The mirror didn't reflect because he wasn't part of the current world. He was part of the next. As the realms began to quiet in preparation, Loki grew louder, but only within. He laughed more, not because things were funny, because everything was unfolding as expected. The serpent's gaze, the sky's pulse, the ground's hum, none of it surprised him. It delighted him, not with glee, with recognition. He had lived a life being misnamed. Trickster, traitor, liar. But the truth was simpler. He was alignment personified. He didn't break things. He revealed what had always been cracked. He didn't summon destruction. He cleared the fog that hid its approach. And now the fog was lifting for everyone. Finally, he didn't need a seat at the table. He had the floor beneath it, and the sky above it, and the sea beside it. Because he had never needed permission. He had only needed the right silence to speak through, and that silence had arrived. He visited Helheim in a blink, one of the few places that did not stir with the current alignments. But he knew better. Stillness was its own language. And Hel, his daughter, didn't speak. She simply watched him enter and offered him no throne, because he wasn't there as a ruler. He was there as a reminder. Her gaze didn't soften, but it didn't harden either. He bowed once and left, because she too already knew. The dead do not need prophecy. They remember how everything ends, and they were waiting, not to rise, but to be met at the right moment, by the right silence, with the right name. He whispered that name as he crossed the threshold back into the waking world, not to summon, to confirm. It was already listening, and it would arrive exactly when the last pattern finished sinking. He returned to no place in particular, because the next place didn't matter. Only the timing did. He sat at the edge of a broken path that led nowhere, and closed his eyes. Around him, the air felt different, not charged, but framed, like a stage waiting for the final player. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't excited. He was aligned. The others were finally learning to feel what he had always known, that prophecy is not prediction, it's gravity. And gravity doesn't warn. It pulls. And when it pulls everything at once, serpent, sky, soil, silence, there is only one thing left to do. Wait without doubt. Loki waited, and the world exhaled. There was one night the stars moved. Not visibly, not all at once, but subtly, like shifting weight on ancient beams. No one noticed it first, not even Odin. But the stars did. Because the sky was no longer looking out, it was looking in. On that night, sailors on distant seas threw down their oars without knowing why. Hunters lost the scent of prey. The moon rose half-formed, then paused, as if uncertain of its path. And across the realms, everyone who looked up felt one shared thought. They were being observed. Not by a god, not by a creature, but by the arrangement itself. As if the stars had finally blinked, and they didn't recognize what they saw. Thor felt it in his chest first, not pain, not pressure, a stillness that didn't belong to him. It was like standing inside a question with no words. Mjolnir felt heavier, not as a burden, but as if the laws beneath it had changed. He looked up, expecting clouds, but the sky was perfectly clear. Too clear. The stars weren't twinkling. They were fixed and watching. He lowered his gaze because he knew the difference between light and judgment. And tonight, the stars were not shining. They were choosing. Across the Bifrost, Heimdall stood still. He did not reach for his sword, because even he, the watcher of all thresholds, knew this wasn't a warning. It was an arrival, not of someone, of awareness. The stars were aligning, not into constellations, but into direction. They were no longer decoration. They were indicators, and they all pointed down. In Vanaheim, crops bloomed out of season, ice cracked in perfect circles. In Svartalfheim, glowing fungi grew in shapes never seen before. Each realm felt it differently, but all understood the same truth. The stars had finished observing, and now they were remembering. Odin climbed the tallest tower in Asgard. He did not bring ravens, he did not bring weapons. He brought silence, because no story had prepared them for this moment, not even the ones he carved into time itself. The stars were not enemies, but they weren't allies either. They were records, and tonight they began to play themselves back, not in voice, in position. A single star fell that night, but not as a streak. It dropped, slow, deliberate, vertical, and it didn't burn, it pulsed. Thor watched it land beyond the mountains. He knew he wouldn't reach it because it hadn't landed for him. It had landed for the world as a marker, a period in the sky sentence. Loki, from a far-off hill, watched the same star fall. He laughed once, not mockingly, just in recognition, because even the stars were now doing what he had done all his life, shifting position to reveal something else. He whispered, "Finally," and the wind answered with silence, but a knowing silence, one that confirmed the arrangement above was no longer passive. It was calibrated, and whatever it was focusing on, it had locked in. In Midgard, shamans awoke from shared dreams. Each one had seen a sky that pulsed like a heart, not fast, but vast, and in each beat, a face appeared, shifting, unreadable, not human, not God, just present, and watching, not judging, just recording. Stars were never decorations. They were data. Odin had always suspected it. Now he knew. Each flicker was a record, each grouping a paragraph. Tonight, the language began to reorder, and it was writing about now, not the past, not prophecy, but presence. Thor returned to the same ridge where he once saw lightning sketch patterns in the sky. This time, no bulbs came, just stars holding still, as if breathless, and from that stillness, Thor felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not awe, but smallness. Not as weakness, as clarity. He had always been a force. Now, he was a fraction of something much larger. And that something was finally looking down. He did not turn away, because some truths are not warnings. They are windows, the kind that open only once, and if missed, do not return. He waited. The stars did not blink, but something behind them shifted, a pattern too large to name. And in that movement, he understood. The stars were not acting, they were reacting to something beneath them, something that had sent the silence, something that had coiled the serpent, paused the storms, stirred the roots. Now it was above, and it was using the stars to say one thing: ready. Heimdall, alone at the gate, watched as each constellation shifted. Just slightly, just once. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography, a movement rehearsed before time. Now playing on the sky's canvas, he did not raise the Gjallarhorn, because this wasn't the end. It was the signal before the signal, a prelude only those tuned to silence could hear. And tonight, silence was louder than ever. In realms untouched by gods, children cried for no reason, and then stopped. Not because they were soothed, because they forgot why they cried. As if whatever had looked down had offered them an answer, one they could not understand, but one they no longer needed to ask. Stars were never gods, but gods were not outside their gaze. Even Odin understood that now. He stood at the edge of his observatory, and for the first time in eons, he felt young. Not in age, in understanding. He had lived countless years, crafting prophecy, shaping fate, exchanging vision for wisdom, and now the sky simply looked back, unimpressed, not angry, just aware. And awareness has its own gravity. Odin bowed his head, not in defeat, in respect, because some forces do not ask for allegiance. They require recognition. And tonight, the sky had become a ledger, and every living thing was being accounted for. Thor did not sleep that night. He didn't speak to the others. He simply stayed on that ridge, watching. At one point, a comet passed, but it curved in a way no star ever had, as if dodging something unseen. He felt no need to chase it, because he knew what mattered wasn't motion, it was alignment. And everything now, serpent, root, storm, sky, was pointing inward, toward a center that had no shape, only gravity. And Thor felt himself drifting. Not physically, existentially, the way one does when they realize their role isn't to stop the story, but to complete it. And so he waited, while the stars did not blink, because now they were witnesses, and nothing would turn them away. Long before the sky turned, before the roots hummed, before the stars aligned, something at the bottom of the sea stirred. It was not movement, it was memory. Jörmungandr had never truly slept. Its coils rested, its eyes closed, but sleep implies peace, and the ocean has no such thing, only rhythms and breaks in rhythm. This was a break, the kind that echoed through the coldest trenches, that parted kelp forests without wind, that silenced currents mid-flow, and it had a name, not spoken aloud, but shaped in the motion of the serpent's spine. It meant now. This wasn't the first time it stirred, but it was the first time everything above noticed, because the sea did not just carry water, it carried memory. Of storms before gods, of pressure before time, of weight so vast even prophecy bent to avoid it. The light that returned to the ocean that night was not sunlight. It was older, dim, steady, and it did not travel. It emerged from within, from the places even the serpent would not pass, not because it feared, because it knew. Some things wait by being still. Others wait by becoming the place waited for. This light pulsed once. It was not seen. It was felt, by krakens deep in hiding, by bones resting at the sea floor that no longer remained still, by ruins untouched for eons, whose corners began to glow, slowly, deliberately. Above, fishermen forgot how to row. Below, creatures moved in spirals, drawn not by scent or prey, but gravity of meaning. The ocean's floor was changing, not rising, not collapsing, rearranging, not into cities, into symbols, not for navigation, for return. Thor had seen lightning from above, but now he dreamed of it from below. Forked patterns beneath waves, silent flashes too deep for sound. He woke with salt on his lips, but hadn't touched the sea in days, because the sea had touched him. Odin summoned the sea gods. Few came. Most simply sent silence, not in defiance, in reverence, because they too felt it, the shift beneath them. And gods of water know the rules of depth. When something ancient moves below, you do not follow. You rise. You make space. The last to arrive was Nord. His beard was soaked, though he had not sailed. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but with recognition. He said, "It has returned." Odin asked what. Nord only replied, "The question." Then he sat down and did not speak again for 3 days. Because some answers are not given, they are waited for. Deep beneath the waves, Jörmungandr shifted one coil. That was all it took. Tides changed across 9 realms, not violently, deliberately, like a clock resetting its hands. Storms reversed direction. Violence shifted half a mile without breaking. And in one forgotten trench, a column of bubbles rose. Not gas, not steam, but memory, encoded in pressure, spoken through silence. It said, not as threat, as record, because the sea does not accuse, it remembers. Loki stood at the shoreline. He said nothing. He only dipped his fingers into the tide. The water did not retreat. It stayed, as if waiting for him to ask a question he'd already asked lifetimes ago. And this time might receive the answer. There were places beneath the sea that even Jörmungandr circled but never touched. One of them began to crack. Not loudly, like ice under thought. Thor felt it in his teeth before he heard it. He dropped Mjolnir to the ground. It vibrated not with thunder, but with tide, because even stone had begun to echo water. He went to the coast where he'd once fought giants. The cliffs were crumbling, not from erosion, but pressure from the other side, as if something beneath was preparing to rise, not in rebellion, but in sequence. The land was making way, not for an army, for an arrival. And above the waves, gulls stopped flying, their wings tucked not in fear, but instinct, because the air now carried something heavier than scent. It carried permission, and the sea was answering. In a hall beneath the fjords, ancient seals began to flake from stone tablets. Scribes were recording it, but no one understood the meaning, because they weren't words, they were timestamps, moments carved in salt and pressure, matching nothing in any known calendar, but aligning with every event no one could explain. In the dreams of sleeping whales, shapes returned, not gray, not predator, patterns, long spirals made of silence. They turned in on themselves, then unfolded into lattices, not meant for interpretation, meant for recognition. And every whale woke at once, singing the same note, a tone not heard since the first waters cooled, and even the stars flinched at its echo. The mortals called it the supertide. The gods did not name it at all, because it wasn't a storm or a flood. It was a correction of weight, of sound, of meaning. In one lost cave beneath the ocean, a flame relit itself. No air, no fuel, just presence. The water did not extinguish it, because the flame was not fire. It was a signal, the same that once marked the edge of time, and now marked the beginning of alignment. Jörmungandr felt it wrap around its form, not chains, not binding, invitation. Because it was not being summoned, it was being harmonized with sky, with root, with silence. And it closed its eyes again, not in sleep, in consent. Thor stood on the cliffs at dusk. He saw no storm. He felt no quake, but the sea stared back, not with waves, with attention, like it had finally found the shape of its reflection in him. He stepped forward. The ocean did not rise. It pulled. Not to drown him, to measure, to see what part he would play when the coil unspooled. And he let it, just for a breath, just enough to understand that what was coming was not battle. It was balance. He whispered, "I'm not ready." The sea did not answer. It only kept watching. Because readiness was not a requirement. Only presence was. In far-off coasts, children dreamed of serpents circling islands, not attacking, cradling, as if keeping them still while the world adjusted. Elders awoke and wept, not in grief, in recognition. Because the ocean had returned to something bolder than fear. At the bottom of the sea, something pulsed again. Not Jörmungandr, but beneath even it. A light so slow, it made decades seem brief. And from that light came no heat, only rhythm. The same that beat through roots, clouds, stars, silence, and now salt. It was the final node, the last part of the pattern. And it had clicked into place. Not loudly, just completely. The serpent stirred, and the sea did not resist, because it had always belonged to it. It did not happen with thunder. It did not begin with a crack in the sky or fire from the roots. It began with a pause, a stillness between pulses, not absence, synchronization. For the first time since their shaping, the 9 realms aligned, not in orbit or distance, but in rhythm. Each realm felt it differently. In Midgard, birds flew in perfect circles for the hour. In Muspelheim, flames leaned in one direction without wind. In Alfheim, light bent and did not return. It was not illusion. It was arrangement. The fabric of the worlds folding toward a shared point, not colliding, coalescing. Odin stood in the high chamber, eye closed, but vision open. He did not speak. He listened. And what he heard was not prophecy. It was harmony. The kind that only comes when dissonance has been fully spent. He whispered a word no one knew. Because the word did not describe something. It described everything, as it now was. Heimdall lowered the horn, not because the moment had passed, because there was no longer anything to warn against. There was no outside anymore. All was inside, folded, aligned, awake. The Bifrost shimmered not as a bridge, but as a thread, no longer a path between places, now a line drawn through them. Its colors held steady, braided tight, not flickering but fused, because there were no more boundaries, only frequency, and the realms began to vibrate in unison. In Jotunheim, glaciers hummed. In Nidavellir, forges fell silent. metal no longer needing to be bent, but listened to. Even in Helheim, the silence changed tone. It was no longer waiting, it was remembering. And that memory reached back further than any living god, to a time before the split, when all things pulsed from one source, and the beat had just returned. Loki felt it first in his bones, not pain, resonance, as if the marrow inside him had always been waiting for this pitch. He didn't smile, he didn't run, he simply stood, letting the vibration pass through him. He was no longer ahead, no longer behind, just in place, properly, for once. Thor felt it next, not in the hammer, in his breath. It moved differently, slower, deeper, more exact, as though even the lungs knew the world had changed. He reached for Mjolnir, but it lifted before he touched it, not from magic. From balance, the weight of the realms had shifted, and now everything was even. Midgard's oceans calmed, not stilled, calmed. Waves moved with purpose, like sentences written by a new grammar. Clouds curved without breaking. Even the winds adopted tempo. And in the deepest forest, animals formed patterns without guidance, not fleeing, just aligning, as if the world had returned to its original sentence, and every living thing remembered their word. In Vanaheim, the river stopped flowing for an entire minute. The water did not freeze, it chose to stay, to listen. And in that listening, flowers bloomed out of season, briefly, perfectly, then dissolved into mist, because beauty was no longer seasonal. It was timed, and the time had arrived. The nine did not speak. They didn't need to. They were not being brought together. They were being returned, not to a place, to a moment, one so old it had become possibility itself. And now it was present. Ravens stopped midair and hovered. Stars held their positions in exact repetition from ancient maps. Runes glowed in texts that had been unreadable for ages. And those who could feel it wept, not in sadness, but in recognition. Because this was not the end. It was the point all endings had been waiting for, and it had finally arrived. Not as fire, not as flood, but as fit. Everything had found its fit. Jörmungandr did not rise. It did not need to. Its presence was already in the pulse, now sinking across the realms. Its vast coils had become part of the shape of unity, not by intention, by inevitability, because even destruction, when aligned, becomes form. Odin spoke once, a single word, unknown to even him until that moment, and the air answered, not with echo but completion, as if his voice had been the last note in a forgotten chord. And now the sound was full. He looked down from the tower and saw not Asgard. He saw one thing everywhere. Heimdall wept, not because he foresaw doom, because for once he did not need to watch. Everything had arrived. In Alfheim, children drew circles in the dust without knowing why. In Nidavellir, the forges reignited themselves. Flames not to craft weapons, but to shape symbols. In Muspelheim, the fire dimmed, not from weakness, but reverence, as if the heat itself had found something warmer than flame. The nine were no longer separate. They were facets, reflections of one thing seen from 9 angles. Now synchronized. No gods gave orders. No banners flew. There was no battle cry. There was only presence. Thor stepped forward, not to strike, to stand. Loki stood beside him. Heimdall behind. Frigg and Freyja joined them in silence. The line was not drawn. It was erased. There were no sides anymore. Midgard's sun dimmed, not in eclipse, but agreement, and the moon brightened in kind, as if both had decided to share the sky without dominance. Time did not stop. It looped, not backward, not forward, just inward. Moments repeated with slight variation, and in that rhythm, something began to arrive. Not a being, not a storm, a feeling. The kind that lives at the center of understanding. The kind you don't speak, only carry. Every root, every cloud, every coil, every silence had led to this. And now the 9 were one. Not forever, but long enough for the message to land, for the memory to take root again, for the pattern to finish sinking. The ground beneath Asgard hummed, not violently, like a voice clearing its throat. And in that hum, old things awakened. Ideas, truths, timelines once thought lost. They rose not as visions, but as awareness. Each god felt it, each mortal sensed it, as if the walls between realms had not broken, but understood they were never needed. No gates stood, no guards posted. There were no threats, only thresholds, and across each one, figures stood, not in defense, not in fear, but in arrival, because they had heard the same thing. Not a call to arms, a call to alignment. Not to fight, to witness.